there's not enough lithium and copper and the rest to do that on a global basis. So if you're looking at American military interventionism to keep copper and nickel and the rest flowing, it will be to keep it flowing to North America. The green transition in its current form cannot be done on a global basis, but it can be done in North America if the Americans invade about 15 places to keep the stuff going there. And Germany probably needs to take a page from the U.S. state of Wisconsin. I don't think the German manufacturing model can continue in its current form for a number of reasons, but that doesn't mean that there is no manufacturing model that might work. So Wisconsin is part of our old Rust Belt. They used to build the cars and the machinery. Now they do a lot of precision work for components that are then flown to other locations for assembly. Now, Germany is a really big country to do that at scale, but if we're moving into a world where supply chains for manufacturing break down on a global basis, the need for the difficult to get parts, I'm thinking transmissions here, for example, for automotive, is going to skyrocket. And Germany's skill set is much more appropriate to that role than the kind of the mass manufacturing capacity that we've become used to in the past.
Okay.
But Germany redesigned its political and its economic model around the realities of globalization in order to take the most advantage of it. France never did. And that's one of the reasons why the French are having all these protests over pensions, because trying to get this into what we might consider a more viable economic model under the globalized rubric has never been something they were interested in. But in a world where global trade breaks down, in a world where global energy is hard to come by, France looks pretty good. Their nuclear fleet takes care of most of their local energy issues, and they're much closer to places like the North Sea or especially northwestern Africa in order to get the rest. They're self-sufficient in agriculture. They've got a much better demographic structure. And most importantly, they never integrated their economic system into the European Union whole in the way that Germany did. In fact, as a percentage of GDP, they're not that much more involved than the Brits are after Brexit. So they don't have nearly as painful of an adjustment to make, and a lot of the things that the Germans and everyone else is going to have to do, the French just consider this a normal operation. If Germany cannot manage a very dramatic transition, Germany will go from being the largest provider of funds to the EU to a net taker, and I don't see how the EU in that situation can exist. Sure. So again, it's those two issues of geography and demography. Now that the world is facing a deglobalization moment, geography is going to be far more important for determining who your trading partners are, and the demographic structure will determine who can play at all. Because if you don't have a lot of people in your 20s and your 30s, you're not going to do a lot of consumption. And if you do have a lot of people in your 20s and your 30s, you're going to protect that consumption and resist imports. If you have a lot of people in your 40s, 50s, and early 60s, you may be very productive, but you still have to have some place to sell your goods, which means you're going to have to be a bit of a security taker in order to access the markets that you need. And then, of course, you break down the global whole and the resources that we need and supply chains that span the world, that all goes away, and it's much more focused on the local. In that, Europe overall is a big loser. The demographic structure is beyond broken in most European countries, and the European continent is heavily dependent upon international trade in order to maintain its economic structure in its current form. And so the trauma of changing that is going to be extreme. The Western Hemisphere looks pretty good. It's net exporter of energy, net exporter of food, and it's in the process of doubling the size of the local industrial plant in preparation for what's going down in Germany and China right now. East Asia, it's like the only part of the world with a worse demographic structure than Europe, and the only part of the world that is more trade dependent than Europe. And so that is a place where these breakdowns get very real and very fast and very loud. Start by saying that what China has achieved since the year 2000 really is impressive. Yeah. They have increased their GDP by a factor of 4 to 5 based on who's doing the math. Now, we all have heard the stories of Chinese statistics and how they're questionable, but let's assume that 4 to 5 factor is off by 20 or 30%. That's still a really good growth story. Yeah. But it was a one-way trip. Two problems here. Number one, it was not paid for with trade or with consumption. It was paid for with debt. And China's debt today, compared to where it was in the year 2000, is 34 times what it was. So yes, their economy may be increased by a factor of 5, but their debt is increased by a factor of 34. To put this in European terms, imagine Greece if Greece had spent 5 times as much. That's China. That's not sustainable. And that is the story of Chinese economic development. It's not exports, it's debt. So that's kind of piece one. Piece two, they, like Germany, had a moment in time. One of the reasons that the German economy has done so well, especially since 1990, is the birth rate fell out back in the 70s. And so by the time you got to 1990, you had a lot of people who were 20 and older and very few children. And so for the next 30 years, 25 years, you had a lot of people in that 20-year-old to 45-year-old group, and eventually they aged into the 40 to the 65-year-old group. And that is where most economic activity happens. The younger group does the consuming, the older group does the production. And Germany was able to basically experience a double boom as a result. China has done the same thing. The one-child policy plus rapid urbanization gutted the younger generation. And so from 2000 until now, they've had a lot of adults and very few children. The problem we're facing now in China is that they have aged well past the point of no return. So this is the last generation that will see economic growth in China. In addition, the Chinese are now starting to grudgingly admit that they overcounted their population by in excess of 100 million people, with all of the missing millions under age 40. So China was aging very rapidly, much more rapidly than Germany, but it was still younger than Germany until the data revisions. And now it's significantly older. And this is the last decade for the German economic model because of aging, which means this is probably the last decade for the Chinese economic model as well. And while Germany focuses on quality and precision in education, China focuses on price. And that's not viable. They've already seen the cost of their labor go up by a factor of, I believe we're up to 16 now since the year 2000. They're no longer the low-cost provider. And with the labor basically dying on its feet, they never can be. They didn't get skilled enough to even attempt the sort of challenge that's in front of Germany. And that, of course, assumes that the Americans decide to try to help, which I find unlikely. You can't rule it out, and it is a one-man state now, so it's really hard to get a read, but I don't think so. The Chinese Navy is short range. They can't project more than about 1,500 kilometers from the coast, and even that assumes it's not wartime. If the ships actually have to dodge and weave, it's less than half that range. That's enough for Taiwan. It's not enough for anything else. And if there was a military conflict, a number of countries with naval assets, the Philippines, Vietnam, India, Australia, the United States, would it be able to shut off the trade and energy arteries that allow China to be a modern industrialized power, with electricity? So shutting China down in a war scenario is really easy. And Xi knew all this a few years ago.
Yeah.
But in the last few years, he has so purged the system that no one's telling him anything. So it's entirely possible that he's now believing the propaganda that a Taiwan war could be encapsulated, that no one will intervene, that it'll be easy, and that the rest of the world will just suck it up and move on. Our experience with Ukraine is that none of that is true, but it is possible in a propaganda world that maybe he does believe it. I find it unlikely that he has descended into idiotic narcissism with that speed.